Welcome to today's program titled Return to Business Phase 1 Massachusetts Reopening Practical Consideration for Employers. This time, all participations are in listen mode only. For those of you who are logged into the web presentation, you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the conference by typing them into the text box on your screen. For those of you interested in obtaining CLE credits for this webinar, an attendance verification code will be ready to read during the presentation that will require on a CLE attendance affirmation form. Please write this code down. It will not be reread. It is required for CLE credit. Copies of this webinar recording and materials will be distributed to all attendees in the days following. At this time, I would like to turn it over to Dan Klein. You may begin.
Thank you, Pamela. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you on this beautiful day. Hopefully we can keep your attention for a little while. We do have a lot to cover, and we're going to dive right in. My name is Daniel Klein. I'm here with my partner, Rob Fisher, and our associate, Chris Kelleher. We're going to try to dive right into the reopening plan here in Massachusetts and give you an overview at first of the overall plan. Then we will, there's the agenda here, then we will review phase one. That part's going to be pretty quick because we do assume that most of you have read news reports, and some of you probably have read the plan closely, while some of you may have not, but we want to at least cover it. And then we really want to quickly dive in to some of the practical requirements and considerations. So part of the plan are the mandatory safety protocols across all sectors. We're going to cover that first. And then we'll get into the office spaces and essential businesses, then to manufacturing, construction, and then on to retail, and then lab space. And finally, we'll wrap up with a little bit of what to expect in phase two. And we have intentionally left time at the end for questions. Hopefully it's around 15 minutes. It may be a little bit under. So we will try to move quickly. Save your questions, or you can type them in now, and we will try to cover them at the end. If we don't get to questions, we will follow up and answer them afterward. So let's jump right in. As many of you probably saw before Governor Baker released the full plan on Monday, he did release somewhat of a preview, and it was consistent with what we saw this week. It's 4 phases of the opening plan. The first phase is the start phase, which is limited industries currently and in the next couple of weeks, and we'll get into a little bit more specifics about that in a second. Resuming operations in addition to those essential businesses that are already in operation. They will have severe related restrictions to COVID-19. The industries that are enabled to open under phase one will be those that are more naturally able to limit face-to-face interactions and close contact, and we've now seen those industries identified, which we will get into throughout the program. In just a minute, we'll provide a specific overview of which industries at which dates are going to be permitted to reopen. Then phase two of the plan is the cautious phase. That's when additional industries will resume operations with COVID-19 related restrictions and workplace capacity limits. And then eventually, hopefully soon, we will move into phase three, the vigilant phase, which will be additional industries will resume operations with guidance and a potential softening of the restrictions. And then finally, phase four will be the new normal. The development of a vaccine, hopefully, and/or therapies will enable the state to move to a new normal. Now, keep in mind that each phase will last a minimum of 3 weeks. They could last longer before moving to the next phase. It's going to depend on public health data, and if trends are negative, then specific industries or specific regions or even the entire state may need to return to an earlier phase. The state is also partnering with industries to draft sector-specific protocols in advance of future phases. We have some of those for phase one, which we're going to cover today. So here on this screen, you'll see just an overview of the public health data factors that are playing into this. And these are the 6 factors. I don't need to read them. You can see them on the screen there. And they use this color coding of green, yellow, and red. Green means a positive trend, yellow means in progress, and red would be a negative trend. What you're looking at on the screen here is actually taken off of the COVID-19 Command Center site that's run by the Department of Public Health. And this is the dashboard that they're updating each day. This is as of last night. It hasn't changed since Monday's release. These are the current codes, and this will be what they use to decide whether any particular sector or region or the entire state can proceed to the next phase or needs to move back a phase. So just generally on the overall reopening before we dive into phase 1, this is a bit of an overview here, at least of the business section, and you'll see phase 1 with some of the dates that we're going to get into for particular sectors, phase 2, phase 3, and then phase 4. Phase 1 began this past Monday, May 18th, and like I said, each phase will last at least 3 weeks. So let's talk about phase 1. All right. Phase 1, we are in it. We are a few days into it, and basically the way it's laid out, for each of the 3 Mondays during phase 1, that's May 18th, this past Monday, May 25th, it's actually Memorial Day, and then June 1st. For each of these Mondays, the following businesses may join essential businesses who are already open. These others may reopen. May 18th, so this past Monday, as you probably read or saw in the news. May 18th, hospitals and community health centers were allowed to provide high-priority preventative care, pediatric care, and treatment for high-risk conditions. Now, that's obviously in addition to the urgent care and COVID-related care they're already providing. Manufacturing. These are all, by the way, subject to safety guidelines and sector-specific protocols that we're going to cover. Manufacturing was allowed to open with these restrictions this past Monday. Construction, also we're going to cover, was allowed to reopen this past Monday with restrictions. In addition, not listed on the screen, firearms retailers and shooting ranges were permitted to reopen on May 18th, and places of worship were permitted to reopen with certain restrictions on May 18th. We're not going to get into the specifics of those. This coming Monday, May 25th, putting aside the holidays, so maybe more likely Tuesday the 26th, office spaces outside of Boston will be permitted to reopen with capacity limitations and other safety restrictions. Chris is going to cover that in a little bit and get into the specifics of that. Also next week, lab space, meaning laboratories, life sciences, will be permitted to reopen. Retail will have a partial reopening in addition to those that were essential businesses. On Monday of next week, they will be permitted to provide remote fulfillment and curbside pickup. And then full store browsing will be part of phase 2. Also next week, limited personal services, as many of you are probably eager to hear. Hair salons, pet grooming, and car washes were included in those. In addition, on May 25th, it's not on the slide, I wanted to add that additional healthcare providers will also be allowed to resume work with high-priority preventative care, pediatric care, and treatment for high-risk conditions. So that's in addition to the hospitals and community health centers that are permitted to do so this week. Next week, that expands to additional healthcare providers, but also with the same types of care limitations. And then finally, on the 3rd Monday of phase 1, June 1st, office space within the city of Boston will be permitted to open, at least under the state order. Stay tuned, and Chris may talk about this in a little bit, whether Mayor Walsh tries to challenge that. He has mentioned that he's not necessarily yet comfortable with a June 1 opening in Boston. However, the way that the state order was written, it sort of took that authority away from local towns and cities to differ from the state order. So perhaps we'll see a clash, or perhaps we will not, but Chris will cover that in a little bit. Keep in mind that all of these are going to be subject, again, to safety guidelines and industry-specific guidance and rules. Also, generally, just outside of the business context, I did want to just quickly remind everyone, you may have seen this on the news, that also as part of Phase 1, the state has said that in addition to social guidance, which will apply across all phases, sort of general tips to everybody to cover your face, wash your hands, socially distance, be vigilant if you reveal symptoms, and to stay home if you feel sick. So those are social guidance provided to all residents across the state for all phases. But then as part of Phase 1, we have moved back to a safer at home advisory rather than a stay-at-home advisory. That essentially, the main parts mean that people over the age of 65 and people who have underlying health conditions who are at high risk should continue to stay home except for essential errands such as going to the grocery store and to attend to healthcare needs. It also means that all residents are advised to leave home only for healthcare, worship, and permitted work, shopping, and outdoor activities. And then, I'm sure you're all, at least all those of you who are living in Massachusetts are familiar with, all residents will continue to be required to cover their face with masks or other face coverings when you cannot maintain 6 feet of social distance in public. So that is part of the safer at home advisory that is applying to Phase 1. In addition, the order says that high-risk populations should work from home if possible, and that they should be given priority consideration for workplace accommodations, at least as far as the state is concerned. That's their guidance. They've also moved the gathering size to less than 10 people. So if you're under 10, you can now gather, while social distancing, of course. And then finally, travel. They have continued that all travelers to Massachusetts are urged, not required, but urged, to self-quarantine for 14 days, and lodging is restricted to essential workers only. Okay, so let's dive into our first segment of the protocols that came out for Phase 1. What I'm going to talk about here are the mandatory safety protocols that apply across all sectors. Then I'm going to turn it over to Chris and Rob to discuss some of the specific industry safety protocols. You will see a theme here. There is much overlap around these four pillars of the mandatory protocols that go across all sectors: social distancing, hygiene protocols, staffing and operations, and cleaning and disinfecting. And then in addition to the 4 pillars, each sector will have specific safety protocols. So even within those sector-specific protocols, it might get a little redundant, and we're going to try not to in our presentation, but if you actually read each of the industry or sector-specific safety protocols, you'll start to see a lot of repetition. There's not a ton of unique differences between sectors. There's some, and some nuances here, and we'll highlight those, but a lot of it repeats the same that apply across all sectors. And frankly, even within some of the sector-specific documents, you'll see a lot of redundancies that the state has released. They sort of have an overall sector-specific document that describes the safety protocols. Then they have a summary, which essentially is a shorter version of that. And then they have a checklist, which is an even shorter version of that, and they're mostly the same. So in terms of all sectors, one other thing we wanted to raise for you before we dive into these, keep in mind that the Attorney General, Maura Healey, just announced a new online complaint form for employees to report unsafe working conditions or a failure by an employer to meet new safety standards. So there is a website with a link, and she's tweeted it out, for employees to report unsafe conditions or failures to meet safety standards. Just wanted to let you know of that. Okay, so the Department of Public Health and the Governor's Reopening Advisory Board have developed these standards, which are aimed at reducing the risk of COVID-19 transmission when businesses begin to reopen their doors. Like I said, these first four listed here will apply across the board during phase one. That also includes essential businesses who are permitted to remain open now, but must meet these standards. And in fact, there's certain documents, control plan I'll talk about in a little bit, that they will need to complete by next week in order to remain open. In terms of the first protocol, social distancing, let's talk a little bit about that. Again, this is across all sectors. This order has said, the reopening plan has said, I should say, that all persons, including employees, customers, and vendors, should remain at least 6 feet apart. No great surprise there. To the greatest extent possible, both inside and outside of the workplaces. They also say that employers should establish protocols to ensure that employees can practice adequate social distancing. I'm sure many of you are already in the planning stages of figuring out your social distancing within your workplace as you reopen. There's also a requirement for employers to provide signage to employees for safe social distancing, as well as to customers if you're in a retail or other public-facing environment, And then there is a requirement for face coverings or masks for all employees. Keep in mind with that, and we'll talk about this probably in Chris's section when we get to office space, it doesn't mean people have to keep their masks on at all times. It's really still when they are not able to socially distance at 6 feet. So it might be in your workplace that you are required to require employees to wear masks, and we would encourage you to provide them if it's required. There may be common spaces either in your building or within your own workspace where social distancing will be more difficult, so they should wear their masks, and they'll be required to wear their masks then. But then if they're in a private office or an area where they're more isolated, not in 6 feet of others, they could actually take the mask off. We wanted to cover just some other, while we're on the topic of social distancing, some other considerations as you reconfigure your workspaces and some best practices. Obviously, everything's built around the 6 foot distance and the ability to maintain that. So if you haven't already, you really should walk through your space in all areas to see where there may be some areas that is not so simple and you may need to reconfigure things. Look at workstation paths. You may have to create one-way aisles like many of the supermarkets have done. You may have to put floor markers down to facilitate social distancing. If you're in your manufacturing, which Rob will talk about in a little bit, you may need to redesign production lines to increase the space between employees. Many are using or ordering right now for use physical barriers such as plexiglass, depending on your space. Even in a private environment where you're not dealing with customers, if you have open workstations without barriers, especially if they're within 6 feet of worker to worker, plexiglass or other barriers may be necessary. Take a look at your conference rooms, your lunch rooms, your other communal spaces. They may need to be repurposed or temporarily shut down to allow proper distance. Limiting in-person meetings, we'll talk about that a little bit today. Obviously, even as we reopen, to the extent in-person meetings are not necessary, they're really discouraged. Posters, in addition to some of the required posters that we'll talk about, as much information and training as you can give your employees about social distancing by poster or otherwise, we encourage it. Some other considerations, reconfiguring or staggering your work schedules and shifts to limit the number of employees physically present in a specific space, staggering meal periods and rest breaks, implementing full-time or part-time work-from-home arrangements where it's feasible, all to maximize the ability to social distance. And keep in mind also that the order still, across all industries, encourages remote work where feasible. The second protocol, hygiene protocols, provide hand washing capabilities throughout the workplace, ensure frequent hand washing by employees, have adequate supplies on hand. Your sanitizers should be 60% alcohol or greater. Provide regular sanitization of high-touch areas such as workstations, equipment, screens, doorknobs, restrooms, etc. With the third requirement, staffing and operations. Provide training for employees regarding your social distancing and hygiene protocols. It's not enough to just have them. You really need to train your folks as they re-enter what the expectations and rules of the game are. Also, have plans in place. If employees are displaying COVID-19-like symptoms, they should not report to work. They need to know that. You should establish a plan for employees who get ill from COVID-19 and create a return to work plan for that. One of the questions that we often get in that sense is folks are planning return to work plans. If someone is actually diagnosed with COVID-19, when do we permit them to come back? This slide just covers two of the options that you may have seen discussed by the CDC and others, sort of a symptom-based approach or a test-based approach. Under the first approach, a person would need to have no fever for at least 72 hours, respiratory symptoms improved, and at least 10 days passing since symptoms first appeared, or if asymptomatic since the positive test. On the option 2, which is test-based, depending on locally available testing resources, they should have no fever, the respiratory symptoms should have improved, and it requires that they receive 2 negative tests in a row. If asymptomatic, just 2 should suffice. And on the final protocol, cleaning and disinfecting, establish and maintain cleaning protocols specific to your business. When an active employee is diagnosed, cleaning and disinfecting must be performed. Disinfection of all common surfaces must take place at intervals appropriate to your workplace, really throughout the day at more frequent intervals than you're probably were doing prior to COVID-19. Some other best practices on the topic of cleaning. Perform deep workplace cleaning prior to your reopening. We highly recommend that. Consider implementing more frequent or robust routine cleaning, as I mentioned in the last slide. Develop a protocol around cleaning workstations. Coordinate with your landlords and building management. Make sure there's adequate cleaning of common areas to the building outside your own private space. Social distancing protocols are likely going to be in place in the building's common areas, but coordinate with your landlords and then communicate them to your employees. Notification protocols in the event of a positive test in the building, those are probably going to be put in place by the building management as well. Consider temporarily removing shared items from your workspaces, staplers, 3-hole punchers, office supplies, controversial coffee machine or coffee mugs. You really need to think how that can work without shared terms and touching. And develop a protocol for shared tools and other items, especially if you're in the manufacturing or lab spaces, as we'll talk about. Some other best practices, good idea to identify a point person to keep track of planning and the changes as things evolve. Evaluate the need to possibly retain an outside safety consultant. Some are doing that. Many are doing that. Determine your minimum legal requirements. We're here today talking about Massachusetts. You probably have, many of you have spaces in other jurisdictions, so you're going to need to know the local requirements. Each of the reopening laws have their own nuances with different requirements as to what's mandatory and what's not, as well as OSHA and CDC guidance. And perform a hazard assessment as required by OSHA as well. Consider health screens for your employees to implement certainly at the outset of reopening, but also many are, as I'm sure you're all discussing or planning, many are looking at doing it on a daily basis, at least for the foreseeable future. Figure out and plan with your leadership team how frequent you're going to implement those and how you're going to do it. There's different options, and there's nothing required in the Massachusetts reopening plan across the board. So some are planning self-checks by employees as to symptoms. Some are doing temperature checks, and that can be either self-administered or done at the work site, or in some cases, some companies are doing both. Obviously, there's ADA and privacy considerations, so take that into account. There's also wage hour considerations if folks are non-exempt employees are standing in line or taking much time to either do a self-check or a check once they get to the office. You may need to compensate them for that time, but you'll need to assess how much time is taken and the risks around that. The EOC has approved checking for symptoms and sending home symptomatic employees and various types of the pre-shift screenings. Again, this can be through a written questionnaire, can be oral. Maybe you have someone at the office that asks certain questions, or maybe it's a posted document that says, if you have any of these, turn around and go home, but you don't actually have an interchange of written or oral exchange of information. What can you ask? What should you ask? Based on the CDC symptoms, looking if they've had in the past 10 days cough, shortness of breath or difficulty breathing, fever, chills, muscle pain, sore throat, or a new loss of taste or smell. These are not all the possible symptoms. There are some other less common symptoms, but those are the official symptoms by the CDC as of late. They've changed and they may continue to change, so just stay up to date with the CDC website. Other questions to ask: whether they've had close contact with a person who has confirmed COVID-19, whether they've had close contact with a person experiencing symptoms of COVID-19, and whether they currently have a fever of 100.4 Fahrenheit or higher, which obviously the temperature checks also go towards. Keep in mind that the pre-shift screening and temperature checks are not mandatory across these sectors, but they are still a best practice, and some form of them is a good idea, at least at the outset. I'll just quickly summarize this, just some things to keep in mind on your temperature screening if you implement it. It is permitted. There's different types of thermometers to use. Have a protocol. If you are going to have someone as the screener taking temperatures of your employees as they come to work, make sure that screener is protected adequately with proper PPE. And obviously sanitization and privacy are important. Just quickly, some of you probably are considering testing. It's not required in Massachusetts, but it is certainly something that many are considering. There's diagnostic testing, which tests for the presence of the actual infection currently, and then antibody testing, which looks for the antibodies that indicate whether the person previously had COVID-19 and hopefully is immune from getting it again. It's what the medical professionals believe to be the case, but there's not enough data yet to definitively say that, but it certainly is presumed. So just keep in mind it's not a cure-all. On the diagnostic test, the negative result today says nothing about possible future infection. Obviously, it just means they don't have COVID-19 presently. The EEOC has approved this testing. It has not addressed whether repeated testing is permitted or not. That remains to be seen. With respect to antibody tests, a negative result does not mean the individual is virus-free. They could potentially have COVID-19, but the antibodies have not yet developed. So don't interpret it to be a diagnostic test. Antibody tests are going to be more valuable in places with higher rates of infection, since there'll be a higher percentage of the population that would actually have the antibodies. If it's a low infection rate area, it's not as valuable of a tool. And there's other practical challenges: shortage of lab technicians, results have to be analyzed by an FDA certified lab, and cost and access issues. Although, of course, more and more kits are being produced and approved as we proceed. Okay, just lastly, and then I'm going to turn it over to Chris to move things along. Part of the plan does have some written requirements go across sectors. Each business, in order to reopen, must develop a written control plan outlining how its workplace will prevent the spread of COVID-19. There's a template the state has created. I have the website link here. It's not that extensive. It's basically built around the same safety protocols we just mentioned. As I talked about earlier, essential businesses may continue to operate now, but must complete this plan by Monday, May 25th. And then everybody else has to complete this prior to reopening. The control plan does not need to be submitted to a state agency for approval, but it must be retained on the premises and be provided in the event of an inspection. Basically, it has boxes to check off for the 4 safety protocols, so it's really not that extensive. And then there is a compliance attestation poster that you are required to have someone from the company sign a poster attesting that you've completed a COVID control plan, and then posting the poster, the attestation signed poster, in an area within the premises that's visible to employees and visitors. And then finally, there are employer and worker posters that are required to post describing the rules for maintaining social distancing, hygiene protocols, cleaning, and disinfecting. These are very basic. They're also available on the website. There's one that's sort of geared to the company, telling everyone what the company's doing. And then there's one geared to workers, telling them what they are expected to do around these 4 safety protocols. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Kelleher.
Thanks, Dan. So as Dan mentioned, there are a number of sector-specific requirements across several different types of industries, and I'll be talking about office spaces. So there are sector-specific guidelines for office spaces, and there's a couple points I want to mention on office spaces that were already operating as essential businesses as well. If we can move to the next slide, Dan. So these sector-specific requirements, as Dan mentioned, are going to be minimum requirements for office-based businesses. So in addition to the kind of general health and safety protocols that Dan just discussed, what I'm going to talk about here for the next few minutes are hopefully more tailored to office environments. And these are the requirements that, if you're going back to an office environment, this is what you need to do to comply with the law. And there are 4 main categories that Dan mentioned: social distancing, hygiene protocols, staffing and operations, and cleaning and disinfecting the workplace. Next slide, please. So I think one of the main highlights from these office-based sector-specific guidelines is the office capacity limits. So this is new, and it applies both to businesses that are going back in the next either May 25th or June 1st or later, and it also applies to essential services that have already been maintaining operations physically. So the requirement is that businesses must limit their use of the office space to either the maximum occupancy levels as specified by a building code or permit or something like that, or B, the business's typical occupancy as of March 1st, 2020. So essentially, whatever your occupancy was before the shutdowns related to COVID-19, your business as an office will be required to be at most 25% of that. Now, essential services, essential services have already been into the office. So if you have been operating an essential service prior to today, and you have been above 25% capacity, you will also need to comply with this requirement. However, essential services will have to July 1st, 2020 to comply. There's another caveat mentioned in the governor's order. It's an exception to the 25% rule, and it states that businesses may exceed the maximum capacity level based on a demonstrated need for relief based on public health or public safety considerations, or where strict compliance may interfere with the continued delivery of critical service. So I think you should think about, especially if you've been operating as an essential service and you're providing, what the governor's order in March stated was, critical or essential service. Would it be a burden to drop down to 25%? If so, perhaps you would qualify for this exemption. There's no indication that we've seen so far that office-based businesses need to clear this exception with the state first. But of course, Dan mentioned the Attorney General's complaint process. The local Board of Health has enforcement authority, so it's something to carefully consider if an office is going to decide to operate at more than 25%. And the final note I'll make on this page, as Dan mentioned, workers are still required to telework where feasible. So that might help make decisions easier in terms of who to bring back. Things might be going just fine in terms of at least a portion of your workforce working remotely. So I'll talk in a little bit about who to bring back and all that. But keep that in the back of your mind. If employees and workers are working remotely and it's working okay, technically under the new rules, they're still required to do that. Next slide, please. So the physical separation, specifically in the workplace, the office environments, as Dan mentioned, 6 feet of separation is the golden rule, and if 6 feet is not possible, requiring face mask use, except for when there's a medical condition or disability at play. Closing or reconfiguring common spaces is one that applies across all sectors. That's break rooms, eating areas, places where employees and workers are likely to congregate. Redesigning workstations to ensure physical distancing. If there are pods without dividers, if tables are close together, if the chairs are close together, redesigning these spaces, perhaps using distance markers to ensure that you're complying with these requirements. And not only complying with these requirements, but making employees and workers feel like they're safe and that the company is doing all that it can to make sure that we're reducing the chance of spreading COVID-19. Cafeteria use. Under the governor's order, cafeterias may only operate as of right now in phase 1 with pre-packaged food only, and of course the other physical social distancing requirements apply in cafeterias as well. Establishing directional hallways where possible, eliminating too many people passing each other in the hallway. If that's something that the business can do, it's required to at least look into it and see if it's feasible. Signage. There's a lot of signage and posting material available on the governor's website, so you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. In a lot of cases, at mass.gov/reopening. That'll help employees understand, what, in addition to the training, and then I'll talk about in a few minutes, what is expected of them. Staggering work schedules, is that something that you can consider? Whether it's start times, break times, establishing shifts, something to, keep people apart, keep people from entering and exiting the workplace at the same time. Those are issues that you might need to look into. Improving ventilation. Can we open doors and windows? And then minimizing the use of confined spaces like elevators, control rooms, cars. Generally under the governor's order and under the guidance, only one person at a time may be in those places. But, of course, when that's not possible, and it's not always possible, those individuals must wear masks at all time when in those confined spaces. Next slide, please. So cleaning and sanitation. Dan talked a lot about this. I think with respect to an office environment, you probably won't run into too many issues in terms of employees having access to hand washing facilities. But of course, if there is an issue with access to hand washing facilities, making sure that there's sanitizer available, making sure that in addition to the hand washing facilities and sanitizer, making sure that the office is stocked with cleaning products, sanitizer, disinfecting wipes. I know I've tried for about 2 months now to find Lysol wipes at my local CVS, and I've been out of luck. So, if you can find them, keeping those regularly stocked and kind of ubiquitous around the office, that will really help comply with these rules. Daily cleaning of workstations, frequently touched objects, things like that, and then the office sharing office equipment. Whether it's copiers, phones, fax machines, generally under the order, office equipment shouldn't be shared and touched by a lot of different people. But of course, that's not going to be possible in a lot of cases. So, in those cases, you're instructed to disinfect the equipment between use, perhaps instructing employees, keeping a sign by the copier or whatever other equipment employees are using communally, a sign that says disinfect before and after use. And again, you'll see all throughout the sector-specific guidelines, posting signage and reminders of these hygiene protocols. is not only required, but it's a good idea. Stay within legal compliance, keep employees, make sure that they're feeling safe, and to potentially avoid legal compliance issues, whether it's with the Department of Public Health, the Attorney General, those types of issues. Next slide, please. So as part of the the office-based sector-specific protocols, employers are required to establish a worksite-specific prevention plan for all office locations. So this includes listing contact information for local health authorities, including the Massachusetts Department of Public Health and whatever local or municipal health authority is handling COVID-19 situations. Regular evaluation of the workspace. It's the office operator's legal obligation to stay apprised of requirements in the office and to make sure you're adapting if there are new requirements. And then coming up with a plan with respect to, in the case of an employee becoming diagnosed with COVID-19 or coming in close contact with somebody with COVID-19, developing a plan with respect to isolation, contact tracing, and communicating to those employees, what to do if somebody is diagnosed. Who do we reach out to? Our request, ensuring that the request will be maintained confidentially. Those types of steps. So that's the prevention plan. Go to the next slide, please. So training. So training is going to be a requirement under the office-based sector-specific guidelines. It's a good idea anyways, even if it wasn't a requirement to make sure that employees know what's going on. You and I are paying attention to the governor's order and all these COVID-19 related restrictions, but your employees might not be. So if you have not been operating and you're going back in the next few weeks, if it's possible to do that training before restarting or as early as possible in the reopen, that's certainly something you should do. It's really important for individuals to understand, this is not the workplace we left in March. This is a totally different environment right now, and we need to make sure we're respecting these new requirements. And also, I touched on a minute ago, these COVID-19 related restrictions change. New requirements are released almost on a daily basis. So staying up to date on, what exactly are the requirements in the workplace, and if there are new requirements that change what the employees need to do, making sure that that's communicated to the employees. The specific training requirements include, some of the obvious topics: social distancing, self-screening, not coming to work when not feeling well, seeking medical attention, and providing employees on information, regarding high risk individuals and that type of thing. With respect to self-screening, you'll notice there's no employer screening requirement. So it's something that should be communicated to employees that the burden is on them, essentially, to identify if they are exhibiting symptoms of COVID-19 and to not come into the workplace if they are. Next slide, please. We talked about staggered hours and shifts. A couple more requirements from the sector-specific guidelines: limiting visitors, making sure that shipping and deliveries personnel aren't walking through the office and are kind of staying in a designated area, and limiting business-sponsored travel. Before all of this, business-sponsored travel, if you've been doing a lot of it, considering whether those meetings can be done remotely. And also considering that other states have restrictive COVID-19 laws as well. Some states have quarantine laws, those types of things. So just being sensitive to and limiting non-required or non-essential business travel is certainly a good practice. Other good practices, and we can go to the next slide, that are kind of called out, perhaps not to the extent that they're affirmatively required, but are certainly best practices. Employees are strongly encouraged to self-identify if they have any COVID-19 related symptoms. One thing that the governor's order and these sector-specific guidelines state is that workers who are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19 due to age or underlying conditions are strongly encouraged to work from home if possible. That there are issues there with accommodation. Dan already mentioned the state, clearly recommends accommodating individuals who are in a high-risk category. There are also things you want to take into consideration, such as, not phasing your workplace back in based on any protected characteristics, such as age or disability. So there's certainly some things to think about on that front. We've talked about it. Encouraging workers who test positive for COVID-19 is to stay home is a must. And then if an individual does report that they've tested positive for COVID-19, they should the company is required to clean and disinfect. And the Board of Health calls for the company reporting to the Board of Health that there has been a positive test, and the Board of Health can help with contact tracing and advising employees on other issues. Other practices, posting notice we've talked about, and logging everybody who comes into a visitor's log is a good way to, if you need to do contact tracing later, having that visitor's log is a good idea. Next slide, please. Cleaning and disinfecting. This is not necessarily sector specific, so I can move past this pretty quickly. With respect to office-based businesses, cleaning shared spaces after use, and that last point there is probably an important one for employers and office-based businesses to understand. In the event of a positive case, the sector-specific guidelines require that the site shut down for a deep cleaning and disinfecting in accordance with CDC guidance. So it's not necessarily clear exactly, how long or to what extent the site needs to shut down, but that deep cleaning in accordance with CDC guidance will be very important if there is a positive test. Next slide, please. So determining who to bring back and when. You might be permitted to return to work on Monday or the following Monday, but it might not be worth it considering the restrictions. Telework might be going well, and we've already discussed that telework is still required to the extent feasible. There are other issues to consider. Whether employees are legally permitted to return to the work site. There's a capacity limit, so only 25% of the workforce can be there. Perhaps a phased reentry is a good idea. Taking it slow at first, keeping it under the 25% limit might be a consideration. Keeping in mind that certain employees might not be able to return right now because of COVID-19 related symptoms, and being sensitive to requests to continue working from home where feasible are all considerations. There are also employees who may be on legally protected leave, and we know that there will be leave issues going forward in the event individuals need to stay home due to COVID-19 related issues. I've already talked a little bit about how to handle high-risk employees who are coming back, but of course, not making those selections based on those high-risk, status as a person in a high-risk category. It's, something to be sensitive to as well. Next slide, please. So it's a good idea, before reopening, if possible, to develop a good organizational approach. Make sure that the office is, kind of in unison and has developed these plans and has really determined the right approach for the business. You know, how important is it to have employees back to the workplace? Is business getting done? You know, these are types of things, you know, certainly to think about. And I touch a little bit on accommodation issues, so I'll just this last slide, the next slide, please. I don't have to belabor the point, but there are certainly accommodation issues for disability. You know, has the office's overall opinion on remote work changed? Are things getting done? You know, if remote work is working and somebody requests to work remotely, at least for the foreseeable future, you know, maybe considering allowing those requests in light of the current pandemic situation. So these are the office-based sector-specific guidelines that all offices are required to abide by to reopen. And Rob will take manufacturing and construction next.
Rob, are you on mute? I thought I hit it and I didn't. I apologize, everyone. I thought I was speaking and didn't realize it didn't go off. Good afternoon. This is Rob Fisher. I'm going to be talking about manufacturing construction protocols. Just to follow up with something that Dan said at the outset, these protocols don't really add a lot more than what's in the mandatory safety standards. They really build off of them. So I'm going to try to focus on what I think is the most distinct aspects of each protocol. And I'll let you read for yourselves some of the more specifics, a lot of which we've already seen several times. So manufacturing, anecdotally, my sense is a lot of manufacturers were deemed essential and were able to reopen. So I don't think the May 18 opening for other manufacturing was particularly dramatic. But there is a protocol that both essential and non-essential manufacturing will have to comply with in order to be open. What I think is the most startling is the first paragraph of the protocol specifies that all workers, quote, must continue to telework if feasible. Now, obviously, you think of a manufacturing environment, you think of an assembly line and people on the ground in the plant, but the primary directive is if there are employees in the manufacturing facility who can still work remotely, they're expected to do that. So the manufacturing protocol is divided up exactly the way the mandatory safety standards are divided up. And so the first pillar, as Dan referred to it, is social distancing. There isn't a lot of it is what we've seen before. I think the thing that's the most important from a manufacturing standpoint is that the employer is obligated to actually re-engineer workstations to delineate the 6-foot separation. And I don't mean you've got to rebuild every workstation, but you do have to use visual markers and other note signage and so forth to designate where the 6-foot demarcation lines are. So it's really not that different as I read the protocol from what we've all seen in grocery stores. However, the protocol specifically says that if you can't space out by 6 feet and workers are going to be within 6 feet of each other, then there needs to be physical partitions between the workers, such as plexiglass, and the plexiglass has to be taller than the workers in order for employees to maintain social distancing. The other interesting thing about manufacturing is that you're supposed to designate particular work areas that employees are supposed to go and limit them to those designated work areas. So, so if someone is in the finishing department, you're supposed to tell them you can only go in the finishing department, and if in business as usual employees have free reign and can go throughout the facility, the protocol requires you to limit that. As someone who spends a lot of time dealing with labor unions, that's going to be particularly challenging. But again, that is the requirement. You're expected to actually control where people go. Like the office space protocol, there is a restriction on confined spaces such as elevators, vehicles, control rooms, where the expectation, and it's an expectation, is that it should be one worker in those confined spaces at any given point in time.
and minimize the circumstances when it exceeds that. The hygiene protocols are really not that different from what we've seen before. The one thing I think that jumps out to me is that in terms of access to hand washing facilities, the protocol specifies that you have to allow employees to take sufficient breaks to wash hands frequently. So I take that to mean that if normally employees have 2 breaks per shift, then you may have to relent on that and allow people to take more frequent breaks so they can wash their hands more frequently than they normally would have to. On the staffing and operation front, there is no 25% capacity restriction like you saw on the office protocol, but there is a specific provision dealing with facilities with what they refer to as highly manual work. Now, that's not defined. There's really nothing in the protocol that specifies what the state's thinking about, but those facilities with highly manual work are, quote, should reopen gradually. As Dan mentioned, there are a bunch of different documents that lay out the various protocols. The summary document for manufacturing specifies that this is a, quote, best practice. So I don't take this as a mandate. I think it gives employers some discretion to develop a schedule and approach that makes sense for their business when they approach methods to limit employee density and to deal with staffing issues. So again, there's no cap right now, but there needs to be some thought as to how you reopen so that to limit the number of employees in place. The protocol encourages employers to encourage their employees, if they're vulnerable, to stay home, to self-identify if they have symptoms, and to self-identify if they test positive. So that's not a mandate that the employer ask everybody whether they take in a test and test it positive, but encourage workers to disclose. And a couple of things about that. If an employee reports a positive test, the protocol mandates that the employer notify the local board of health to aid in contact tracing. So unlike what Chris described as a best practice, this appears to be a mandate in the manufacturing sector. And the protocol then says, as part of the contract tracing process, as you work to see which coworkers this employee has been in contact with, you may have to instruct employees that they have to isolate and self-quarantine. On the cleaning and disinfecting, again, it's pretty much what we've seen already, but 2 things that I want to highlight. One is that the regular cleaning has to be done after each shift. So if you're a manufacturing facility that has 24/7 operation to just run multiple shifts, you're going to have to plan logistically for doing a cleaning of the facility and workstations after every shift. Second, the protocol makes clear that in the event of a positive case, and this is different from some of the other protocols, a manufacturing facility must shut down at that point to do a deep cleaning and disinfecting. The protocol doesn't specify a timetable for how long you have to be closed. I read that to mean that so long as you're meeting the deep cleaning and disinfecting requirement, you can reopen once that's done. I'm going to turn to construction. A couple of comments generally. One is the construction protocol doesn't mirror the mandatory safety standards the same way that manufacturing did. It's much more ad hoc, and surprisingly, it's very focused on what employees should be doing, and it's even written as directives to employees. The other thing that should be mentioned is that the rules are different depending on the type of project that you're talking about. Small residential projects have lesser rules than larger private buildings, and then publicly funded or managed projects have their own rules as well. I'm going to try to focus on the non-residential, larger private projects. And a couple of things that I think are interesting about the protocol in general. If you're going to restart a stalled construction project, besides determining that your permits are still up to are still good, You actually have to notify the city or town where the project is occurring, and you may have to meet whatever requirements the city or town impose to demonstrate that you're meeting the industry-specific protocol. So it's obvious that there is a role to play for the local community in determining the timetable for the project. And in fact, I want to mention the cities of Boston, Somerville, and Cambridge have already issued their own orders regarding the phased reopening of construction. And as Dan mentioned, they would seem to conflict with the governor's order and the timetable issued by the governor, but that they are out there that you won't need to keep track of. Couple of big requirements. One is that every non-small residential site, the site must have a specific COVID-19 officer who's responsible, obviously, with compliance. And what's interesting to me is that a large complex project has to have a specific site-specific risk analysis and COVID-19 safety plan, which then has to be presented for approval to the local city or town. And the protocol makes clear that a violation of the plan is the same as a violation of the standard. As I said at the outset, there's a lot of emphasis on what employees are supposed to do, and you'll see on the slide in caps the word zero tolerance. That's the way it's actually written in the protocol in caps. And when I think of the phrase zero tolerance, I think it means if an employee does something, they're going to get fired. There's no lesser discipline that's going to be imposed. And here, they don't quite mean that. The protocol says there is, quote, zero tolerance for workers who are sick coming to work. And not surprisingly, the protocol requires that if someone has symptoms and you observe them with symptoms, you've got to send them home. Coworkers are supposed to effectively direct their peers to their supervisor if they see someone who's sick. So it's a lot of coworkers sort of keeping an eye on each other. The protocol does mandate that employees self-certify every day and every shift that they've got no signs of COVID-19 symptoms, they haven't been in close contact with someone who's got symptoms or tested positive, and that they haven't been asked to self-isolate or quarantine. So that is a process that every general contractor is going to have to impose for workers on the site that they're going to have to use for every shift. And if the employee can't self-certify, they're going to have to leave the site, which one thing that's interesting about that, it seems to contemplate that this self-certification is going to happen when the employee arrives at the work location. And another interesting point is that the protocol requires that the employee cannot return until cleared by a medical professional. So the CDC guidance has been that employers are discouraged from requiring employees to have a doctor's note before they can return to work for the obvious reason that we don't want to overwhelm the health system with these types of requests. But the construction protocol makes it clear that an employee has to be cleared by a medical professional if they've been sent home or can't self-certify. And then a lot of the protocol, and I'm just going to show you, the next slide just gives you a feel of the kinds of detail, and it's really granular. It literally has things like no handshaking. It talks about using toolboxes and tools, and so there's a lot of detail, but again, it's very ad hoc. One thing I want to highlight is obviously a lot of construction sites are outdoors. If there's no access to indoor bathrooms, the general contractor is going to be required to install wash stations. So that is one obvious infrastructure type piece that they're going to have to contemplate. But otherwise, it's the similar types of things we've been seeing already. And I want to now shift to retail. There is no specific protocol for retail that was announced this week. And in fact, I think retailers in general were somewhat disappointed with what the governor announced on May 18th. It is worth understanding sort of where we are on retail because the rules are different for both essential retailers and non-essential. So obviously, retail businesses that sell essential goods are allowed to be open. And up until May 4th, retailers selling non-essential goods were not permitted to be open at all. And on May 4th, the rules changed, and effectively, those retailers selling non-essential goods could fulfill online and telephonic orders, subject to what I think of are pretty strict restrictions. One, obviously, the store has to remain closed. Two, the employees are limited to performing packaging and no-contact delivery, meaning they can't be manufacturing anything. They can ship things out or they can do deliveries, but that's it. And technically, there's no requirement for curbside pickup, which I'll get to in a minute. They have to wear face masks. They have to maintain social distancing. It's not listed here, but they have to do temperature checks. Staggered shifts, start and stop times, which we've heard. And then the thing that I think is the most restrictive is that there are limits on the number of employees that are allowed in the store. And effectively, it goes by square footage. And essentially, it maxes at 7 people. So if you're a store, or I should say a distribution center or warehouse of more than 30,000 square feet, you cannot have more than 7 employees on the premises at any one time. So, if you think about a big box retailer or some retailer that doesn't sell essential goods, they can only have 7 people in the facility, in the warehouse or the store, to do order fulfillment. Those were the rules that were put in place on May 4. Those rules remain in place, and all that has changed as part of Phase 1 is that beginning on May 25, retail stores may now engage in curbside pickup, as well as the remote order fulfillment. The governor's order contemplated that there would be some guidance as to what curbside pickup would entail, but as of about 9 o'clock this morning, and I haven't had a chance to go back again, there was no guidance as to that issue. So for now, we're waiting to see what's going to happen on retail. The governor has signaled that Phase 2 will involve in-store browsing. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dan, who's going to talk briefly about laboratory spaces.
And I'll be very brief. There's not a lot of new information here, and I want to get to the questions. Lab spaces can open May 25th. There is a requirement, like with the others, that all workers must continue to telework if feasible. It states it as a requirement in certain places. In one other document, it mentions it as best practice, but it repeatedly uses the word must. It's in the opening paragraph, and the overall intro to the main memo says that these are minimum requirements, and that is then included. So where teleworking can be done, it is a requirement. Social distancing, no big surprises here. I would just add the only unique thing is the recommended best practice of improving ventilation for enclosed spaces where possible, including such as open doors and windows. On hygiene protocols, nothing too earth-shattering here, unique to labs, other than the fourth bullet mentions the avoiding the shared use of lab materials and equipment, such as goggles, disinfecting equipment between uses, and obviously visible signage will be important. And on staffing and operations, again, the main principle, telework if possible, provide training, meetings should be remote or virtual, and it does mention restricting access of office workers to the lab and segment the office from the lab if feasible. Also, as Rob mentioned with manufacturing, there is a requirement that employers notify the local board of health if there's a positive case at the workplace, and also a requirement that the office, or the site, I should say, shut down for a deep cleaning and disinfecting if there is a positive case. Rob, you want to give us a quick preview of phases 2 and 3, and then we'll open up to questions?
Sure. Thanks, Dan. And before I do that, I just want to give out the CLE code for those of you who need it. The CLE code for today's program is SS, as in Seyfarth Shaw, 9974. So SS 9974. So as to phases 2 and 3, here's what we know at this point. And this is the slide that Dan actually put up near the beginning of the program. We expect, first of all, as to phase 2, as I mentioned, retail in-store shopping is going to be permitted, is from what we understand. We also anticipate restaurants and lodging to start, that the easing of restrictions in that area is going to happen. On those two industries, I strongly suspect that we're going to get specific industry guidance as to those, particularly as to restaurants, because of obvious social distancing issues. We're going to see additional personal services like nail salons and day spas. And then phase 3, the goal is for bars to open up. And by bars, they mean specifically service establishments that don't have a kitchen for food service. So, a restaurant with a bar would be a restaurant, not a bar. Some arts and entertainment facilities. And as to that, there's a distinction between large venues and smaller venues. Large performance venues will not open according to the current plan until phase 4. So that means when there's a vaccine, and then smaller venues are phase 3. The distinction between small and large is unclear. And then lastly, for those of you who are anxiously awaiting sports, even without spectators, that is a TBD. So we don't know yet where that's going to fit, but we know it's coming. At this point, that's the end of the substantive program, and we're going to turn it over to questions. So I'm going to turn this back to Pamela for the question portion.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, we'll conduct a question and answering session. To ask a question via the web presentation, just type your question into the text box on your screen.
Okay, so we'll try to move quickly here, and anything we can't answer, we will answer in writing. One question: if someone is based outside of Massachusetts and commutes to the office in Boston, does he have to self-quarantine? The mention I had earlier of the overall phase 1 protocols of travel was a urging, not a requirement, that travelers self-quarantine for 14 days. So technically, it no longer seems to be a requirement. I don't know, Rob or Chris, if you disagree, but if not, we'll move on to the next question.
I agree, Dan.
Okay. Should employers train employees before they allow them back on site? Rob or Chris, what do you think about that? Before they actually get on site, do they need to do the training, or can they do it on the first day back?
Well, with respect to offices, sorry, Rob. With respect to offices, it's certainly a good practice if it's possible to do. Of course, it's not always possible, but Rob, I'd welcome your thoughts as well.
So that's exactly the point I was going to make, which is I just think it's going to be extremely difficult to bring people in and train them and maintain social distancing and have that be an effective training. So I personally think that doing a pre-return to work training is the way to go. Obviously, there are wage and hour considerations that you want to think about before you do that. But I certainly think you would want to approach it, if you can do it before people return to the facility, that is the way to approach it.
There was a question in terms of the requirement for training on social distancing and hygiene. What are employers doing for this? Are there free training resources available? Do you guys have any information on that?
There might be. There's a lot of resources at mass.gov/reopening. I don't remember seeing a specific training document or protocol, but there are specific steps that you certainly need to include in your training. I'm not sure it needs to be as formal as you might think, but I would check mass.gov to see if there are any, and of course they're updating that site all the time. If there's any particular training protocol for your sector.
And I would add, part of the question also that I didn't read was, is handing out or emailing the CDC guidance sufficient? I would say no, because almost all of the training requirements are about the particulars of what you're putting in place in your workplace. And so that simply handing out the CDC guidance is not going to do that. Does repeated testing pose an EEOC or ADA issue, whereas one-time testing does not? So in other words, if the EOC endorsed one-time testing, is a reason we would expect it not to endorse repeated testing. Rob is one of our EOC experts. What do you think about that?
So, I mean, obviously, as the point you've made, they've never officially said address the issue. From the person who raised the question, I get the logic of it, which is if you're doing it for initially, and it's a legitimate basis to do it in the first instance, and given the limitations on testing, why wouldn't it be appropriate to do a second wave of testing to ensure, for all the reasons you had the first time? And I tend to agree with the logic, but I can't tell you definitively that the EEOC is going to say that's okay, because they just haven't given us any indication one way or the other.
Okay, we're just about out of time. There's a question that showed up in several forms. What about visitors and the office capacity limits, Chris? On the 25% capacity limit, how does that affect visitors?
I don't think it includes or takes into account visitors. So I think it's more of a work staff, the workforce. But the sector-specific guidelines also do instruct to limit visitors. So that's kind of a general precaution that you need to take. But I think with the 25% capacity, it only applies to the staff itself.
And a related question while we have a second, is the office capacity limit just for phase one? I think the belief is that the 25% will gradually increase, but it'll depend on testing, and there's not any discussion yet what comes next.
Right, and it looks like essential businesses have a deadline of July 1st to get into compliance with that 25% requirement, and so hopefully we're in maybe phase two by then, I don't know. So it seems like it's something that might stick around for a while, at least in some form.
Just lastly, before we close it out, is the must a real requirement for telework where feasible? What happens if an employer wants to bring back folks that are able to telework? What if the employee does not want to go back? What recourse is there? So a bit of a loaded question on the back end. I would say that in these various specific safety sector-specific protocols, it is a must. While it was mentioned as a best practice in some places, in other places it was mentioned as a minimum requirement. Now, obviously, there are still encouragement and in some cases obligation to accommodate folks who cannot come back to work because of a disability or a membership in a vulnerable population. If they can telework, that's obviously choice number one. If they can't, then other accommodations may need to be put in place, such as unpaid leave, or if they have paid time, partially paid leave. I think the last resort that anyone wants to do where it's truly necessitated by vulnerability to COVID-19 is to separate them. So it may result in an unpaid leave for an extended period of time if that is the only option. But other accommodations should be explored first. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll try to answer the last few questions we didn't get to. And Pamela, please close us out.
This concludes our webinar for today. Thank you for attending.